Welcome back. Here's the thing. A lot of Republicans think the Democratic Party has moved way to the left, and a lot of Democrats think Republican candidates trip over themselves to claim who is more conservative. Here's the reality. Most of us live somewhere in the middle. But if you are a non-affiliated voter in Florida, you can't vote in the Democratic or Republican primaries. Or let's say you're a Democrat, but really like that former Republican Congressman David Jolly, who you see all the time on TV taking on President Trump and congressional Republicans. You might well vote for that Republican despite the fact he calls himself a proud conservative, despite sometimes taking shots at Democrats. You might be tempted to vote for David Jolly because he doesn't always go with the flow. When it comes to his own party, he calls it the way he sees it. But David Jolly isn't on the ballot this year because he knows there is no way he can win a Republican primary, even though he might be able to win a general election with help of Democrats and independents. He is not on the ballot, but he's at the trapezoid, along with Frank Alcock, a political science professor at New College. David, did I get it pretty much right?
Yeah, that's great. You should be my spokesperson if I do run.
I'll tell you what my own personal position has always been. Tell me why I'm wrong. Is it too much to ask if you're the Republican Party or the Democratic Party that you have members of the party vote and not have independents or Republicans or Democrats, playing games in terms of trying to maneuver who is the nominee?
I'm glad you bring that up right out of the gate, because there's a case to be made for closed primaries. And in fact, the Supreme Court has supported that going back all the way to the 50s, I believe, in an NAACP case about the freedom of association and closed organizations. The state senator before the break said he would be worried about cross-voting. And that's true, although that would not often happen. The reality, though, is you have to make a political value judgment. And what we see in modern politics is that parties have insulated their own incumbents, and you have elected officials only listening to the voices within their party. And it's an all-or-nothing, winner-take-all in November, as opposed to creating a system that rewards members for reaching across the aisle. Oftentimes when we talk about accountability, it's about punishment. What I like to talk about is how can we create stronger candidates in both parties? A Republican that can hold their base but win independents and Democrats, a Democrat that can hold their base and win independents and Republicans.
Frank, isn't this a reflective of where we are in general? It seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, that we are becoming so much more partisan than we used to be, that whether you're on the left or on the right, it may be the candidates we nominate are only reflective of that.
We are becoming more polarized. There's lots of data out there. There are a number of reasons for that go beyond gerrymandering and non-competitive districts, have a lot to do with media consumption and the balkanization of information. But getting back to this issue, I think we're talking about who represents a political party in a competitive general election, I think the value of autonomy and allowing Republicans or Democrats to choose who represents their party in a competitive election, I understand that, but the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of political districts out there, especially if you get out of below statewide districts, they're not competitive. And so when we're talking about the probability of one political party's candidate winning, being 95 to 100%, then effectively that primary is not a primary. It's really an election of who's going to represent the entire district. And at that point, if you do not open it up to a broader range of voices, there are compromises that you're making on competition and accountability. And so there's a sacrifice of values that comes with keeping a closed system. And I think by opening it up, there's a lot to gain and not as much to lose.
David, when you were running the first time and even the second time, what kind of pressures were on you from the party in Washington to basically, stick to the script?
Oh, enormous. And in part, the three-legged stool is a gerrymandered district, closed primaries, and then campaign finance. And you need the money from the party, so you have to be good to your party. Your question about polarization, though, is interesting. We're seeing polarization because polarization is being rewarded at the ballot box because of these structural challenges. Alan, when I got elected, I had a moment that I like to think most members of Congress have. I hope they do, which was I realized I held the public trust. And though I had only been elected by about 2 points, largely all Republicans, I believed my job was to represent everybody. And so I woke up trying to think about how can I as a Republican represent Democrats? I struggled with that every day and I tried to honor that. But the reality is, for most members of Congress in a closed primary gerrymandered district, the only way to get reelected is not to represent your whole community. It's to represent the party that insulates you and funds your campaign. That's what we're trying to break up.
Frank, I remember a day where there were more moderate or conservative Democrats and more moderate Republicans. I mean, I grew up in New York where Jacob Javits was a Republican, but he was a liberal Republican. That doesn't seem to exist anymore.
No. Again, there are more than one reason for that, but it is a climate where people that truly feel like they're independent voices and combine a combination, say, of values that do represent a district, and it puts them in a position that is not adhering to the extreme wings of a political party. There's no safe space for them anymore, and part of the reason is, if we have closed primaries in non-competitive districts, it is a very a small amount of folks that have a lot of influence. And what Congressman Jolly said, that's a dilemma that representatives have to face. Who am I accountable to? If you have a sense that you're accountable to everybody that you represent, that's great, but you're not going to be around for very long. And that's why I think we have a lot of folks representing us that don't feel like they're accountable to their entire district, just a very select few that control the outcome of a primary.
But David, a critic might say, look, you could always primary the incumbent congressman. You could always, primary the party favorite. It happened a couple of years ago with the House Majority Leader who lost his bid for re-election.
Not with a moderate, though. You're always
You're
always going to primary them from the extreme wing.
That's exactly right. You cannot primary somebody from the middle because you don't have a constituency in the middle, because they are not prohibited to vote in a primary. The good news about this, though, Alan, is we are seeing changes to the primary system in states across the country. It's being talked about in Florida. California's adopted this top two, which is everybody gets to vote in the primary. The top two candidates move to November regardless of party affiliation. And we're seeing a bunch of different modifications. At the end of the day, and this really is important, we want all voters to have a voice, right? Your question at the beginning, shouldn't primaries be closed to only party members? If you ask the public that, about 60% say, yes, only party members should choose their party nominee. But if you say, should every voter have access to the ballot? That's a 90% response you get from voters.
Frank, again, if you are an independent voter, a non-party affiliated voter in Florida, you are basically shut out of the primary system, whether it's for a House race, Senate race, or even the presidential cycle.
That's right. And if you're an independent voter that doesn't happen to be in a competitive district, and competitive districts are few and far between in general elections, then you actually have no say whatsoever. You can't even walk in and influence the primary election unless you change your party affiliation.
And we're going to talk about there are a number of different systems out there, but also, David, look, we just had the Constitutional Review Commission unanimously vote against putting this up for a vote.
Because incumbents don't want it, because it threatens their incumbency. This is all about protecting power in Tallahassee and Washington. Here's a way that we could split the baby, if you will, and have a system that I believe really works. Have closed primaries, that's fine. But then when the parties nominate a Republican or a Democrat, they go to November. But if I'm not the party's nominee, I should still have access to the ballot as well. And when you, Alan, receive your ballot, you would see the nominee of the Republican Party, the nominee of the Democratic Party, and all of these other registered Republican and Democratic candidates that you could choose from.
Okay, we are just getting warmed up. We'll have much more on open primaries right after we check the first alert weather. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking about open primaries, and joining us for more are former Republican Congressman David Jolly and New College political science professor Frank Alcock. David, let's talk about, I'm interested how it's done in California, because as you said, anybody could run in the primary and the top two then face off each other in the general election. It could be two Republicans, it could be two Democrats, or whatever.
Yeah, and this is a newer experiment. One of the things with open primaries is we don't have a lot of conclusive data from any of these state experiments. The top two primary is something that intuitively people say, yeah, that does seem fair, right? If the top two candidates are chosen, they should go to November. The data out of California is a little obfuscated because it's such a deeply blue state, and so you're seeing a lot of Democrat versus Democrat opponents in November.
Frank, if the move to get this on the ballot in the Constitutional Revision Commission really did not go anywhere, where is the possibility of it getting to voters here in Florida?
A citizens initiative. I think you're going to have to, the citizens are
Like
going
the
to have to
solar,
take it.
initiative?
Right.
I think if people understand what the initiative is, and there are multiple options, so you have to choose one. You can't put multiple options as a proposed constitutional amendment. But I think there'd be a lot of support for it. It's just something that not both political parties and some of the minor parties are not in favor for it because they like to retain party control. But I think it's certainly something that with enough sustained effort and some funding, you could get enough signatures for it to be put on the ballot.
Finally, David, until something is done to open up the primary system, where do Republicans like you go, who you're not a supporter of the president, you are not a Democrat, and you've told me before you're not going to switch over to being a Democrat.
Right.
Where do you go if you want to have an impact on what happens?
Yeah, that's a hard question for somebody in my position. It's hard for me to find a home in the Republican Party, but I would also say I can't find one in today's Democratic Party either. They're having their own family conversation. I think the time is right for some type of third party to emerge, but we know history has proven what an enormous challenge that is. And without maybe $500 million behind it from a benefactor, that's not practical. So today I choose to stay in the Republican Party, but some mornings I wake up and I'm just not quite sure if I'll still be there by nightfall.
Okay, we have to leave it there. FYI, you can watch past discussions on demand. They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. And for the latest on local breaking news, don't forget to download the updated version of our app. If your current app doesn't work, it's expired. Just go to the App Store and re-download it by searching for WWSB or My Suncoast. We want to thank our guests, former Republican Congressman David Jolly and New College political science professor Frank Alcock. When we return, we're going to be joined by another former Florida congressman. Patrick Murphy will be here to explain why he thinks Florida should consider open primaries, so stay with us. Welcome back. We have heard what former Congressman David Jolly has to say about open primaries. Now let's get another former Florida Congressman, Patrick Murphy. Congressman, thanks and welcome back to the ABC 7 at 7. Let me start by asking you the same question I asked Congressman Jolly, which is, if you are a Republican or a Democrat, shouldn't you have the right to expect that it will be Republicans and Democrats who vote in their party's primary?
Well, this is sort of the crux of the question here. Because what you see happening both in Florida and really across the country is more and more people getting frustrated with this two-party system. More people being tired of the extremism they're seeing out of Republicans and Democrats and wanting a third option. You look at Florida, about 1/3 of the population in Florida are Democrats, 1/3 Republican, 1/3 independent or no party affiliation. Those 1/3 that are NPA or independents do not have a say in our primary system. So many people, could make the argument that about 1/3 of Florida, several million people, aren't going to influence who the ultimate, candidates are on the ballot, and therefore probably discouraged to even show up and vote because they didn't have a say in the process. I would rather have more people have access to the polls, give more people a voice in our democracy, which would encourage, I think, turnout in the primary, but often better turnout in the general election.
What impact do you think the current system has on the quality and the types of candidates that both parties nominate?
Well, what you're seeing in primaries, and start because of the gerrymandering, the districts that are drawn in such a manipulated way, but then beyond that, the small turnout in primaries is about 15% of the country is determining 90% of our representatives. That, of course, is not a true cross-section of our community, and that's why I think you're ending up with so much gridlock in the Congress or even in Tallahassee, because the politicians are pandering to the extremes. When independents and moderates oftentimes do not show up in these primaries, the base of both parties are dictating the policy. And the politicians know exactly who's going to show up to vote. They can tell you with pretty good certainty those several thousand people in a congressional district are going to vote, what they're going to vote on. Are they NRA members? Are they environmentalists? What are the magazines they read? What are the websites they go to? And they can put all this information into an algorithm and come up with pretty good certainty how you're going to vote, when you're going to vote, and what you're going to vote on. That, to me, is manipulating the system. I think it's better to have more people, involved in our primaries, more people that are capable of voting, and let the politicians and the candidates make an appeal to everybody based on what they think is right, not just to win an election.
I am wondering, when I think about open primaries, that if it's possible that people on either side can play some games. Let's say you have a very attractive Republican candidate who the Democrats may fear in the general election. Why not, put up somebody who could challenge that candidate and somehow manipulate the situation? If independents could vote for them, you may be messing up a situation where the Republican Party or the Democratic Party is able to get a candidate who has the best chance of winning.
Right. I think the same thing could be said about the system we have today, where you could have a Republican Party or a Democratic Party, whatever the case might be, fund a third-party candidate to sort of take away some votes from somebody. Or you could fund someone from, say you're a Republican and there's a strong Democrat in the race. You could fund, theoretically, a very liberal Democrat to hurt the current Democrat that's in the race, or make him or her take positions that they otherwise wouldn't. So I think you can, if you're malicious, of course, always manipulate the elections to some degree or the other. But that gets into kind of the bigger structural problems we have in politics with the money, the outside, influence of money, that gerrymandering, the media, people's, time that they're dedicating to getting information, and what's really behind each of these candidates' motives.
Obviously, that you and Congressman Jolly have been going around Florida and around the country talking about something that we don't see very much these days in terms of bipartisan leadership and bipartisan cooperation. But Tallahassee is pretty, you have a Republican governor and a large majorities of Republicans in both the state Senate and the state House. How likely would anybody up in Tallahassee be to open to this idea where you have open primaries?
I don't think they're going to be very open to it. I actually think the only way you're really going to get it done would be a ballot initiative, something put up by the voters where you got the necessary hundreds of thousands of signatures to make this a ballot initiative, get it approved by the authority to get it on the ballot, and voters decide, hey, do we want independents involved in the primaries? The way it is now, to your point, you have Republicans in charge of the governor's mansion and both chambers, the House and the Senate. It would be against their self-interest to have independents vote in primaries. Their members that are already in place and the power structure that they have already, kind of put together would really break down if that were the case. Not that they couldn't rebuild it in one way, but it would certainly hurt those in power right now. Therefore, I don't think they would ever vote for something. It would have to be done independent of Tallahassee itself and done by the voters.
A number of states do things in a different way than we do that here in Florida. For instance, in California, you have a primary situation where you have Republicans and Democrats and members of other parties or independents run in one primary, and the top two winners of that primary go on to the general election. I'm wondering if you think that is a system that you would like to see here in Florida.
This is a really interesting study in political science. California is, one of the states that's doing this right now, and I've talked to my friends on both sides of the aisle, and I've heard different stories and read different examples about whether this is working or not. It's certainly a case study worth examining, and I think we might need another year or two to really, watch the progress here. But in theory, it is forcing the candidates to solve problems, to get to the middle and get things done. And the voters are less likely to get the more extreme candidate on either party elected. I think ultimately that's a good thing. I think ultimately our voters and ourselves, we should all want, progress out of our government, generally speaking. And to see things move. I think it helps get that done. One example I could point to in California is, don't quote me exactly here, but something like over the last 10 to 15 years, California hasn't had a budget that got passed. Right after they did this new top two system where the top two candidates moved on from the primary to the general election, they passed the budget immediately. Maybe there's other reasons, I don't know. But that's a small example of how maybe people realize they better start working together, getting things done if they're going to get reelected.
All right, Congressman Patrick Murphy, thank you very much. We want to thank Congressman Patrick Murphy for joining us tonight. When we return, ABC 7's business insider Richard Stern will join us, so stay with us.